They said she fled, vanished into myth, left Jerusalem behind for foreign shores. But what if she never left at all? What if Mary Magdalene, the most mysterious figure in the story of Jesus, was buried right there beneath the city that tried to erase her, not in France, not in legend, but in stone and silence, under the very feet of the faithful? There's a tomb no one will talk about, a name that appears where it shouldn't, and an order quiet, powerful, that ensured it all stayed buried. Until now. Let the world above grow quiet. Let the hum of the city fade, and the echoes of long-sealed chambers take their place. You're not just listening to history. You're entering a place it never meant to show you. The streets of Jerusalem have seen more than most cities dare to remember. Empires have marched over its stones. Prophets have cried out from its gates. And beneath it all, a second city sleeps, a honeycomb of passageways, ossuaries, and secrets too fragile for daylight. Somewhere down there behind a locked vault, or beneath a forgotten slab, lies a question that could upend the very foundations of Christian history. Mary Magdalene, not the sinner, not the saint, the witness, the one who never left his side. Her story was never quite erased, just redacted, reshaped, whispered over centuries until only the outlines remained. And yet there are records, inscriptions, hidden maps. They point quietly again and again, not to the south of France or to the apocryphal West, but back here, to Jerusalem, to a tomb that shouldn't exist. If what's beneath the city is what some believe, it would mean everything we thought we knew about her, about him, was built atop something else entirely. Tonight, we follow that trail. We descend into texts, forgotten vaults, forbidden, and clues buried not just by time, but by intent. And what we find may shake loose the stones of memory themselves. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You begin with an echo, a soft murmur carried down centuries of candle-lit corridors and dust-covered libraries. The Church Fathers, those stern-robed architects of Christian doctrine, rarely spoke her name, and when they did, it was in tones weighed down with discomfort. Mary Magdalene, not the Virgin, not the Mother, the other Mary. She appears in their writings like a shadow, acknowledged, reframed, then gently pushed to the edges. It's not what they said that matters most. It's what they didn't. Tertullian, Origen, and Jerome, men whose pens defined orthodoxy, walked an uneasy line when it came to her. They couldn't quite erase her. After all, even the Gospels placed her at the crucifixion, at the tomb, the first to see him risen. But they could diminish her, redefine her, blend her identity with other Marys, even fold in a so-called prostitute's sins to muddy her legacy. It was subtle, almost surgical. And yet if you listen closely between their lines, you catch the nervous flicker of something deeper. A fear, perhaps, that she knew more than she should, that her version of the story was different and dangerously persuasive. The Council of Laodicea, convened in the 4th century, was where many believed the slow pruning of inconvenient texts truly began. Certain Gospels were labeled heretical, banished to the winds. Among them, writings where Mary played a central role. In some, she spoke with the voice of authority, asking questions that silenced the male disciples. In others, she was the one Jesus trusted most. That's not just radical theology, it's ecclesiastical dynamite. And for centuries, it sat smoldering beneath the polished marble of orthodoxy. But even in the act of erasing her, they left fingerprints. In a fragment attributed to Clement of Alexandria, there's an offhanded reference to those who cling to Mary's gospel. A footnote in a theological treatise by Hippolytus mentions a sect that believed wisdom resided in the Magdalene. That word wisdom isn't accidental. In early Christian mysticism, Sophia divine wisdom was often personified. Could they have seen her as more than a disciple, as a bearer of sacred knowledge? And yet the Church never fully excommunicated her. She was canonized in time, repainted as a penitent figure weeping at Christ's feet. But even in that redemptive pose, her story felt abridged. A woman worthy of reverence, yes, but not leadership, not memory, and certainly not a tomb anyone should go looking for. Which brings you to a curious footnote in a Syriac manuscript dated to the 7th century. It describes a gathering of early bishops in Jerusalem, troubled by the place of burial of the apostola. That feminine form apostola was rare, almost never used. Some scribes would later correct the word, but the original ink remains faint but legible. A female apostle. In Jerusalem. A body-interred location concealed. What made them hide her, you wonder? Was it merely discomfort with her gender? Or was it something more tangible like a site, a chamber, a relic whose very existence would force the Church to reframe its own origin story? It's here that a gentle irony settles over the investigation. The very men who worked to contain her legend may have also preserved it unintentionally by reacting to her presence with such bureaucratic panic. Their edits and evasions are like ripples in otherwise still water. You learn to spot the disturbance, to read absence as presence. And in those gaps, a different Magdalene begins to take form. You remember that glimmer from earlier, the suggestion of Mariamne inscribed near the Kidron Valley, and begin to wonder whether the Church Fathers were less guardians of truth and more curators of the official version. Their hesitations, their contradictions, become your trail markers, not because they pointed the way, but because they tried so hard to erase it. That's the strange beauty of whispering walls and buried names. They don't stay quiet forever. The moment you begin comparing the Gospels, those bound sanctified accounts chosen for mass reading, and the apocryphal texts that huddled in desert jars for centuries, you notice a pattern forming. It's less like discovering a lost road and more like realizing the map you were given is missing half its lines. Mary Magdalene is there in both, yes, but she wears different robes, speaks in different tones, and in one version disappears far too conveniently. In the canon, she's a witness. She sees the crucifixion when others flee. She finds the empty tomb. She's the first to encounter the risen Christ, though in the Gospel of John, he tells her not to touch him, a curious detail for someone supposedly favored. And then, with little explanation, she fades. No farewell, no mention of where she goes, no closure. But the Apocrypha, that's where the fire burns. The Gospel of Mary, discovered in the 19th century, reads like a challenge, not just to doctrine, but to authority itself. In it, she recounts a vision given by the resurrected Jesus, a conversation the male disciples never heard. When she shares this vision with them, they scoff. Peter, in particular, questions why Jesus would have spoken to a woman in private. Levi defends her, but the damage is done. The tension is laid bare. It's a drama not just of theology, but of power. Another text, the Pistis Sophia, places her at the center of dozens of questions and teachings, far more than any male disciple receives. Again and again, she's the one who understands, the one who asks the right questions, the one he praises. Yet this isn't the version you grew up with. This is Mary the theologian, Mary the visionary, Mary quite possibly the successor. And here's where things get uncomfortable. If she was truly entrusted with this knowledge, if she was meant to lead, why was she sidelined so completely? Why did her story end with an empty tomb and not a new mission? Some claim it was simply patriarchy at play. Others suggest something more calculated, that her presence threatened the entire emerging hierarchy of a male-dominated church. To let her speak too loudly was to risk a different kind of Christianity, one built not on martyrdom and succession, but on mystical insight and radical equality. Among scholars, the debate rages on. Was the Gospel of Mary written to correct the canon, or does it preserve something older, something deliberately edited out of the official story? There's no consensus, but one thing is clear. These texts weren't lost. They were hidden, buried in caves, sealed in jars, protected perhaps by communities who feared they might vanish entirely. And so you begin to wonder not just where she went, but who helped her go. Was she smuggled out of Jerusalem? Or did she remain her movement forced underground, like the texts themselves? If her followers were preserving her words, might they have preserved her body too? You recall that strange phrase from the Syriac manuscript, the Epistola, and its link to a hidden burial. That passage no longer feels like a linguistic anomaly. It begins to sound like a breadcrumb. But even more telling is what's not present in the canonical texts. No mention of Mary at Pentecost. No reference to her among the early church leaders, even though she had every reason to be there, every qualification. The Gospels go to great lengths to name her, and then never tell you what happened next. As if you were meant to stop asking. And yet here you are asking anyway. Asking whether the canon and the Apocrypha are two windows into the same house, or whether one is the house and the other is the cellar beneath it. The Gospel of Mary may not tell you where she went, but it confirms one thing with absolute certainty: someone wanted her to disappear from the spotlight, but not from the story. You can feel her shadow stretching beneath the words, beneath the redacted passages, beneath the very streets of Jerusalem. And somewhere in that darkness, a tomb may be waiting. You start noticing the silence before you even finish asking the question. Mary Magdalene, central to the resurrection narrative, revered in some texts, controversial in others, suddenly vanishes. Not into death, not into legend, but into editorial thin air. One moment she's announcing the risen Christ to the frightened disciples. The next, she's gone. No farewell, no burial, no trace, and it's not just the canonical texts. Even in apocryphal writings, her trail dissolves after a certain point. There's no Acts of Mary, no early epistles addressed to her, no second-century theologians quoting her teachings. For someone so pivotal, her absence is almost theatrical, like a character whose final scene was deliberately cut from the play. Of course, that's when the theories begin to stir. Some say she fled to Egypt, slipping into a Gnostic sect that kept her teachings hidden. Others claim she went further to Syria, Armenia, even southern France. But what's rarely considered, at least seriously, is the possibility that she didn't flee at all. That she remained in Jerusalem. That she died there, quietly, secretly, and was buried beneath the city that tried to forget her. A 9th-century Armenian text, mostly ignored outside monastic circles, describes a holy woman of Galilee interred near the eastern walls of the old city. The name isn't given, but the placement is odd. That area wasn't a standard burial ground. It was sacred, restricted, used for honored figures and clandestine interments. The same manuscript refers to a small sect who made pilgrimages there under cover of darkness, leaving no trace behind. The implication is clear: someone lay beneath those stones, someone who had to be remembered in silence. Could it have been her? There's another clue, more architectural than textual. In the shadow of the Kidron Valley, archaeologists unearthed a series of 1st-century tombs hewn into the limestone. Most had been looted or collapsed. But one remained sealed its entrance, bricked and plastered in a manner inconsistent with standard Jewish burial practices. The location places it near what would have been early Christian gathering sites, and yet there's no marker, no family name, just a single carved shape at the doorway, faint but unmistakable. A fish, the earliest Christian symbol. It's enough to make the hairs on your arms stir. Now, mainstream historians are cautious. Burial records from the 1st century are incomplete at best, deliberately misleading at worst. But the lack of evidence becomes suspicious in itself. A woman so present in Jesus' final moments should have warranted some acknowledgement, some farewell. Instead, you get fragmented trails, discarded gospels, scribbled marginalia, a faint pulse of remembrance muffled under stone. You recall the whisper from Clement's writings, those who cling to Mary's gospel, and it starts to feel less like metaphor and more like logistics. Maybe her followers clung not just to her teachings, but to her physical presence. Maybe they protected her tomb with the same zeal others guarded relics. Maybe it's not that her memory faded, but that it was placed somewhere memory couldn't reach beneath the ground. There's a haunting logic to it. If she held secrets too volatile for the Church Fathers to publish, then her bones were never going to be paraded as relics. They'd be hidden, venerated quietly. Their location passed in whispered lineage, then forgotten when the last keeper fell silent. One theory rarely published, but murmured in back corners of certain academic conferences, suggests that the early church splintered not just over theology, but over burial rites. That there was a brief, bitter struggle over who would be honored in stone and who would be entombed in secrecy. Magdalene, being both essential and inconvenient, may have been buried with love but without permission. And so the silence deepens. You remember that cave sanctuary described earlier, the one beneath Jerusalem where prayers are still scratched into the walls by unknown hands. It's small, unadorned, but there's a particular word carved more than once: she. Not Mary, not saint, just she. As if her identity was both universally known and too dangerous to write. Where did she go? Maybe nowhere. Maybe you've been standing above her all along. There's something uniquely unsettling about a voice trying to speak through torn parchment. The Gospel of Mary is incomplete pages, missing lines, frayed, but what remains feels like someone pounding from the inside of a sealed vault, desperate to be heard. And when you finally listen, really listen, it's her voice that emerges. Calm, wise, unapologetically bold, and completely unlike anything you were told to expect. It was in 1896 that a German scholar strolling through the dusty markets of Cairo stumbled upon a 5th-century codex, now known as the Akhmim Codex. Inside it, hidden behind more acceptable Christian texts, was a revelation, a gospel attributed not to Matthew or Luke or John, but to Mary. Not the mother of Jesus, not just a Mary, but the Mary Magdalene herself. Noted in the manuscript as Mariam, her voice cutting through centuries of silence like a whisper wrapped in thunder. What survives of the gospel is fragmentary, but the core is unmistakable. After Jesus' resurrection, Mary shares a vision, a conversation she alone had with him. She speaks of the soul's ascent of spiritual realms and invisible guardians, and the disciples grow uneasy. Peter, in particular, questions her right to claim authority. It is Levi who defends her, insisting that if the Savior deemed her worthy, who were they to reject her? This is not a story about repentance. There are no tears at Christ's feet, no perfume poured over wounds. This is a story about authority, and that is precisely what made it dangerous. The early church, grappling with doctrine and hierarchy, had no interest in elevating a woman who dared to teach apostles, The Gospel of Mary doesn't contradict Jesus. It contradicts the institutional church that rose in his wake. And so it vanished. Not burned, not cursed, just excluded. Pushed to the edges of memory where it might quietly fade. But it didn't. It resurfaced. And it's not the only one. The Nag Hammadi Library, uncovered in 1945 by a pair of Egyptian farmers near the town of the same name, contained over 50 ancient texts, many of them Gnostic mystical and far outside the bounds of Christian orthodoxy. Among them were writings that placed Mary Magdalene at the heart of the movement. In the Gospel of Thomas, she appears as a confidant. In the dialogue of the Savior, she speaks more than any male disciple. And in the Pistis Sophia, her questions form the backbone of Jesus' post-resurrection teachings. All of this leads to a haunting suggestion that the early Christian movement may have splintered not over the divinity of Christ, but over the authority of Mary. Modern scholars remain divided. Some argue that these texts reflect later theological developments. Others insist they preserve older traditions deliberately omitted from the canon. But no one denies their impact. They don't just complicate Mary's legacy, they explode it. Suddenly, she's not just a witness. She's a thinker, a theologian, a leader. You recall the earlier hints the female apostle mentioned in Syriac ink, the ambiguous ossuary with a fish, the unmarked cave scratched with the word she. None of it feels so vague anymore. A pattern begins to form, not just of suppression, but of survival. Someone kept her teachings alive. Someone preserved her words when it was dangerous to do so. And if they preserved her writings, is it so impossible that they also preserved her body? Here's where the Gospel of Mary becomes more than just a text. It becomes a map. In one passage, Mary describes an inner place, a sanctuary the soul must pass through. Some believe this is symbolic. Others suspect it's literal, that the early Christians who followed her may have carved out an inner sanctum, a tomb hidden beneath sacred ground, where her teachings were guarded not in books, but in stone. And if that's true, the gospel wasn't buried. It was entombed, waiting. It begins with a limestone box. Unremarkable at first glance, weathered, chipped its carvings worn by centuries. But ossuaries have a way of outlasting memory. In first-century Judea, they were used to store the bones of the dead once the flesh had decayed. Small tombs, big secrets. And sometimes names etched on their surfaces carry more weight than anyone dares admit. In 2002, a box surfaced that sent waves through both religious and archaeological circles. On it, a curious inscription, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. The world fixated on the implications of those three names, sparking fierce debates about authenticity, provenance, and forgery. But as attention swirled around James, a quieter question arose from within the same region of finds. What about the ossuaries that weren't labeled, the ones that weren't linked to men? Out of the approximately 900 ossuaries recovered in the vicinity of Jerusalem, a surprising number bear female names. Most were dismissed as common, non-identifiable individuals. But one unearthed from a tomb near the Mount of Olives bears the inscription, Mariamne e Mara. Scholars squabbled. Was it one woman with a title, two different individuals buried together? The name Mariamne had already caused a stir when associated with the Talpiot tomb, a crypt unearthed in 1980 containing ossuaries inscribed with names matching Jesus' inner circle. The name Mariamne itself was rare, and yet it appeared again and again in contexts too suspicious to ignore. In Greek, Mara can mean master or lord. Some early Christian communities used it for female leaders. The idea that Mariamne, also called the Master, lay in that stone box would be controversial, to put it gently. Potentially explosive, to put it accurately. Most archaeologists were careful, even evasive, but a few dared to ask, could this be Mary Magdalene? The canonical Gospels never use the name Mariamne for her. But other texts do. The Acts of Philip, a later but intriguing apocryphal document, refers to her by that very name and places her in missionary work alongside Philip, healing and preaching with authority. Whether this was a literal recounting or a veiled homage is debated, but the title Mara stands out. It suggests leadership, reverence, a role far beyond the reformed sinner of church tradition. When Israeli authorities catalogued the ossuary, the inscription was recorded, photographed, and quietly stored. No museum display, no public announcement. It joined dozens of others in warehouse anonymity, locked away from curious eyes, but not from memory. Scholars who saw it before its disappearance noted its unusually careful inscription, its richer-than-usual decoration, and the strange fact that its tomb had been sealed far more thoroughly than others nearby. You think back to the Gospel of Mary and the phrase inner place. You remember the silence of the early church fathers, and you begin to wonder, could this box have been a placeholder, a decoy, or even just part of a larger puzzle? A physical echo of someone whose legacy had to be buried twice, once in flesh, once in text. The ossuary gives no answers. It holds no bones anymore, but its message lingers. A woman named Mariamne, possibly revered, possibly erased, possibly entombed beneath the city she was never supposed to outlive. Of course, mainstream experts dismiss the theory. They claim the names were common, that the site lacked context, that the link to Mary Magdalene is coincidence piled upon coincidence. And maybe they're right. But it's funny how coincidence and silence tend to walk hand in hand. If Mariamne was buried in Jerusalem, and if she was who some suspect, then somewhere beneath the stones of the city, her true tomb may still lie sealed, untouched, guarded not by angels or curses, but by the fear of what she might still be allowed to say. And when you consider how loudly stone can speak, that silence begins to feel deafening. It's easy to walk past the caves without noticing. Jerusalem, after all, is a city built on layers, temple above street, street above tomb, tomb above older things still. But just beyond the city's eastern edge, nestled into the rugged descent toward the Dead Sea, lie clusters of cave sanctuaries, carved by hand, lit once by oil lamps. Their walls speak in faint scratches and smoky residue, the faint breath of prayers long ago swallowed by stone. These aren't grand basilicas. They weren't built for pageantry or public liturgy. They were intimate, hidden. Some no larger than a pantry, others wide enough for a dozen followers to sit cross-legged in silence. Many contain crosses etched into stone, some marked with fish, and others with the Chi-Rho, the earliest symbols of Christ. But in a few, something different appears. A name, or rather a title. Apostola. It's scrawled in ancient Greek on the curved wall of one chamber, nearly lost beneath soot and centuries of weathering. Faded, yes, but unmistakable. Feminine in form, rare in usage, and accompanied by a single unmistakable depiction, a figure in a robe hand-raised not in prayer, but in instruction. This wasn't a place of mourning, it was a classroom, a sanctuary of memory for someone who taught. Historians have long debated these underground sanctuaries. Some call them monkish hideouts used during Roman crackdowns. Others argue they were early community churches born before steeples and pews. But a quiet faction within the archaeological community whispers another possibility, that these were the last physical echoes of a following that centered not Peter or Paul, but Mary. And it's not just the inscriptions. One cave in particular, discovered in the 1920s and then promptly reburied under layers of bureaucratic concrete, held a fresco fragment so degraded it barely registered as human at first glance. But enhanced imaging revealed a woman's face, eyes wide, halo intact, and beneath it a name scratched in a less practiced hand, Maria. Not Miriam, not Mother, just Maria. And above her, once again, that curious term, apostola. You remember how the Gospel of Mary painted her as the one Jesus trusted with his final message. You recall Peter's scorn, Levi's defense. That textual confrontation now has a mural to match. Because if these caves were sanctuaries for a group that revered her above the others, they weren't just preserving her words. They were preserving a lineage. This, of course, clashes with centuries of ecclesiastical narrative. The idea that Mary Magdalene was more than a repentant sinner is uncomfortable enough. The suggestion that she may have been an early church leader venerated with her own secret sanctuaries that would require a theological audit few are willing to consider. And yet here it is in cave chalk and crumbling fresco. These underground churches weren't isolated. Some connect via narrow corridors forming catacomb-like complexes with multiple chapels and shared features. One chamber contains 7 niches carved into the walls, each the right size for a burial yet empty. Above them is a phrase too worn to fully translate, but a fragment remains those who follow her. Not him, not them, her. Could these have been her disciples, the remnants of a sect that carried her teachings, her memory, maybe even her body? It's tempting to draw lines that no one dares trace on official maps. From the Gospel of Mary to Mariamne's ossuary, from the bricked-up tomb to the hidden caves of Judea, all pointing just faintly to a woman buried not just in the ground, but in history's footnotes. Skeptics argue that the caves were used by multiple groups over time, that inscriptions are layered, confused, and they're not wrong. But even amid the jumble, certain patterns remain consistent. The reverence for a female figure, the repetition of the title, the curious absence of traditional saints. You remember the unmarked ossuary, the gospel sealed away in a Cairo market, the cave carvings no guidebook mentions, and the silence begins to feel like choreography. Someone, perhaps many someones, worked hard to let her memory die quietly. But some memories refuse to die. They hide, yes, but always in places where the curious might someday look. Like caves, like cracks in limestone, like forgotten tombs beneath a city still too nervous to let her name rise again. She watches from alcoves and shadowed corners painted in hues too dark for coincidence. The Black Madonna statues and icons scattered across Europe, cloaked in mystery and soot, has long stirred speculation. Some say the darkness is simply the result of candle smoke, others argue for symbolism, regional skin tones, or ancient soil. But none of that quite explains the consistency, nor the reverence, nor why in so many of these depictions the child she holds looks nothing like the fair-skinned, golden-haired cherubs of Western canon. And in some of these Madonnas, the woman herself is no passive mother. She's upright, watchful, sometimes regal, occasionally fierce, a queen, not a caretaker, a figure who holds not just a child, but a secret. It's in Eastern Europe, particularly in Byzantine mosaics and Balkan monasteries, that the image becomes even more compelling. Their inscriptions link the Madonna not to Mary the Mother, but to Maria the Witness. And while witness may seem a general term, its timing and location tell another story. A fresco from a 9th century chapel in Macedonia depicts a female saint with braided hair, an open scroll in her lap, and an inscription that reads, Maria of the Tomb. It's an odd phrasing easily overlooked. Most saints are named for cities or miracles. Of the Tomb sounds more like a warning than a title. In the same region, a 10th century Eastern Orthodox hymn untranslated in Western liturgical texts refers to she who saw and did not forget, and describes a woman bringing light to the dark places of the earth. Though officially interpreted as the Virgin Mary, the timeline doesn't fit. The text places this woman at the resurrection, not the nativity. And in the margins of a related manuscript, a monk had added in red ink, Magdalene. This pattern of reverence just beneath recognition mirrors what you've already seen in the caves outside Jerusalem, a worship that doesn't dare speak its name. Then comes the unexpected twist. A 13th century Serbian codex, heavily damaged but partially preserved in a monastery attic, describes a lady of the Eastern Path, whose body was never taken from the city of the cross. It's unclear whether this refers to spiritual presence or physical burial, but the emphasis is telling. The city of the cross, Jerusalem, and a body that never left. Suddenly, all those black Madonnas in shrines far from Israel take on new meaning. Perhaps they aren't reflections of the Virgin at all. Perhaps they're the long memory of another Mary, one exiled from canon, but not from the hearts of her followers. Art historians tend to scoff at this theory. They point to iconographic traditions, pigments, aging, varnish. And all of that is fair. But what they rarely explore is why the devotion persists, why entire towns still process barefoot through mountain paths to honor these Madonnas. Why some of the oldest shrines bear names like the Lady of the Hidden Light or She Who Knows the Path. These are not maternal titles. These are initiatory ones. And the blackness. In Gnostic thought, black was not evil. It was mystery. The hidden. The inner sanctum before illumination. In that tradition, Mary Magdalene wasn't just a witness. She was the embodiment of Sophia wisdom, both divine and earthly. To depict her in dark tones wasn't a slight. It was an honor. You recall the fresco of the woman labeled Apostola, the ossuary, with the title Mara, and the cave inscription of She. None name her outright. All point to someone both known and concealed. And here across seas and centuries, she appears again, face-darkened eyes, steady, never identified by name, but unmistakable in spirit. Not erased, just recoded. Not forgotten, just recolored. There's something beautiful in that. Even as official doctrine pushed her to the edges, the people, peasants, pilgrims, iconographers kept her close. They lit candles to her, sang hymns, called her Madonna, yes, but knew somehow that she had once been something more. And if this visual devotion passed down in paint and mosaic was meant to preserve a truth too dangerous to speak, then somewhere still that truth may lie in wait. Possibly in a sealed chamber. Possibly beneath the very city they said she left behind. It's the version you've probably heard. Mary Magdalene, after the Crucifixion, sails across the Mediterranean with a small band of followers. She lands on the southern coast of France, somewhere near Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, and lives out her days in quiet contemplation, or depending on the telling, in fierce missionary work. Some legends say she preached in Marseille. Others claim she lived as a hermit in a cave, surviving on nothing but the tears of repentance and the songs of angels. It's romantic, poetic, and incredibly convenient. The French narrative has endured for centuries, bolstered by medieval pilgrimages, relics, and the rise of local cults. Her supposed skull, encased in a gold reliquary like a holy Fabergé egg, is still on display in the Basilica of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume. pilgrims climb up steep forest paths to the grotto where she allegedly wept for decades. And towns named after her dot the landscape like breadcrumbs left for the curious. But here's the thing, none of it appears in early Christian texts. Not a word. Not a hint. The Magdalene in France story doesn't emerge until nearly 1,000 years after her death, when the Catholic Church was facing regional instability heresies and an inconvenient resurgence of interest in Gnostic texts, texts that cast Mary not as a penitent sinner, but as a spiritual equal to Jesus. Suddenly she's in France, harmless, cloistered, saintly in a way that never questions authority. It's a tidy resolution, one that transforms her from theological lightning rod to local mascot. Still, there are physical clues, bone fragments, iconography records of pilgrimage routes that lend the story a sense of weight. But they're all dated centuries too late. Retrospective miracles, carefully embroidered traditions, as if a narrative was stitched together not from fact, but from necessity. Some scholars point out that the rise of the Magdalene cult in Provence coincided with the Catholic Church's campaigns against the Cathars, a Gnostic-leaning sect accused of heresy. The Cathars revered Mary Magdalene not as the Magdalene of Rome's repentance, but as a vessel of secret knowledge, a carrier of Christ's true teachings. Suppressing that version of her wasn't just about theology, it was about power. And what better way to control a legend than to redirect it by relocating her to France, by giving her a tomb, a shrine, a set of well-behaved miracles. The Church could safely domesticate the dangerous undercurrents of her legacy. She could still be venerated, but only on their terms. The fire of her apocryphal role doused in the incense of canonized myth. Yet even in this neatly wrapped story, inconsistencies remain. The cave where she supposedly lived, it bears architectural traces far older than the tradition itself. The skull enshrined in the basilica forensically dated later than the 1st century. The boat she allegedly arrived in never mentioned in any Roman shipping records, even though other arrivals from the Levant were carefully noted. The French legend begins to feel like a screen, perhaps not a fabrication, but a deliberate distraction. A way to move the search away from Jerusalem, where too many questions remained unanswered. Because if people believe she died in France, they'll never think to look beneath the holy city. They'll never question the sealed tombs, the cave churches, the strange ossuaries marked Mariamne. They'll never ask about the Jesuit report, or the forbidden excavations, or why certain locations in Jerusalem were quietly locked down after unapproved digs. It's an old magician's trick to divert attention with one hand, while the other performs the real illusion. And maybe, just maybe, that's what happened here. You recall the Black Madonnas in Eastern Europe, the cave carvings in Judea, the term apostola scratched into ancient stone. They all point back to Jerusalem, not away from it. Yet here stands an entire tradition celebrated and institutionalized, meant to tell you she went elsewhere. It doesn't add up. Unless it's not meant to. Unless the point was never to document where she went, but to make sure no one ever asked where she truly remained. There's something hypnotic about staring at an ancient map. The world rendered in crumbling tiles and faded ink borders, where none should be rivers curling like veins across the body of an old empire. The Madaba map mosaic masterpiece of the 6th century, embedded in the floor of a Jordanian church, is no exception. At first it seems a marvel of Byzantine cartography, a sacred rendition of the Holy Land centered around Jerusalem. But then your eye catches something odd. Near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, tucked just outside the cluster of iconic labels, sits an unassuming Greek word, necroterio cemetery. It's not what you'd expect. The location doesn't match known graveyards. It's strangely close to a site identified by earlier pilgrims as Golgotha. But it's not the presence of a cemetery that's curious. It's what lies next to it. A red tile, slightly discolored. Some believe it was damaged during restoration. Others suggest it was removed and later replaced, but upside down. And beneath that, barely legible, an abbreviated inscription, Maria. The rest is missing, erased, or perhaps never completed. Some say it's just coincidence. Others believe it once read Mariani or Maria I Magdalene, Mary Magdalene. If that were true, it would be the only surviving Byzantine-era map that locates her burial in Jerusalem. And this brings us to the pilgrim. Egeria, a 4th-century traveler from Hispania, left behind a detailed travelogue of her journeys to the Holy Land. Her writings are invaluable, providing some of the earliest descriptions of liturgical practices in Jerusalem. But one entry stands out, a brief, almost casual mention of a sealed place of devotion that no one was allowed to enter. She writes of being led past a chamber by her local guide, who murmured that it was a place kept for the woman disciple, and immediately changed the subject. She doesn't elaborate. The entry moves on to describe evening prayers and the beauty of the Mount of Olives. But that line lingers. The woman disciple, not a martyr, not a saint, just the woman, and a chamber, sealed. Modern scholars have pored over Egeria's account, searching for context, but the reference is elusive. Some claim she misheard. Others say the scribe may have embellished or erred. But the fact remains, a 4th-century pilgrim mentioned a secret devotional site associated with an unnamed woman, and the only woman disciple ever consistently granted that title across texts is Mary Magdalene. Now pair that with the oddity of the Madaba map, the off-center tile, the scrubbed name, the graveyard that's not quite in the right place. And suddenly this isn't just about maps, it's about misdirection. Because if that chamber still exists, if it's still sealed, then there's a physical space within the old city that may hold a story no one's prepared to let out. Jerusalem has changed since Egeria's time. Wars, quakes, new structures layered atop the old. But some tunnels remain. Some vaults were never reopened. In 1974, an Israeli team exploring under the Christian Quarter stumbled upon a bricked-up corridor. Records show their permits were abruptly revoked, the findings never published. But one entry in the logbook of a now-retired archaeologist notes a single chamber sealed from within, contents unknown. He didn't mention what made them stop digging, only that they were told not to return. There's no proof this chamber corresponds with Egeria's mention or the map's anomaly, but the triangulation is difficult to ignore. A pilgrim's warning, a cartographer's error, an archaeological pause, all pointing to a place beneath a place just waiting. And this is where the story bends a little, because unlike texts and legends, a sealed chamber is not a metaphor. It's real, physical. If it's ever opened, it won't just confirm or deny a theological theory. It might contain bones, symbols, artifacts, something that breathes with the weight of withheld truth. You think of the title Apostola, the scratched Maria, the ossuary with Mariamne. You recall the French diversion, the Black Madonna, each hint circling back not to Provence, not to Egypt, but here to this city that wears its secrets like layers of dust. And if what lies beneath that map tile is what some suspect, then the oldest part of Jerusalem may still have one more name to give up. Jerusalem has a habit of forgetting inconvenient architecture. Tombs appear in early records only to be quietly erased from modern maps. pilgrims describe caves or crypts beneath certain churches only for later renovations to discover that no such spaces exist. But beneath the streets in places you're not meant to look, echoes remain of chambers once carved for memory, now buried in deliberate silence. It begins with an inventory. Not a myth, not a legend, but a bureaucratic ledger drawn up by British mandate officials in the early 20th century. Between 1917 and 1948, as the region transitioned from Ottoman to British control, a flurry of archaeological surveys were conducted. In one overlooked annex of the Mandate archives lies a list: 12 subterranean tombs noted beneath the Old City, all identified between 1921 and 1936. Each was catalogued with GPS approximation sketches and brief condition notes. Most were described as bricked, sealed, or inaccessible. Oddly, not one was ever fully excavated, and after 1948, all 12 entries vanish from the records. The explanations offered over the years range from the mundane reconstruction efforts mislabeling to the absurd. Some were dismissed as cisterns, others supposedly collapsed. But local lore tells another story. In interviews from the 1970s with Christian, Jewish, and Muslim elders in the area, multiple witnesses recalled excavation teams in the 1930s being escorted by guards and officials, then dismissed suddenly without explanation. One Arab shopkeeper, now long past, remembered his grandfather saying that one tomb had inscriptions in Greek letters no one would read aloud. And in a particularly strange case, a letter sent from a Franciscan friar to his superior in 1934 notes a discovery beneath the stones of the sisters' quarter, describing a chamber of unnatural silence and a niche that faced neither east nor west. The letter ends abruptly with a plea: "Do not speak of this to the archivist. I fear it may be removed from the lists." You think again of the chamber Egeria mentioned, the sealed room kept for the woman disciple. If it were among these 12, it would explain a great deal. The vanishing records, the lack of excavation, the quiet interruptions by church and state alike. But perhaps the strangest clue lies in a 1952 photograph taken by a young student from the École Biblique et Archéologique. He had been photographing ancient water channels when he accidentally captured what appears to be a carved entrance half obscured by rubble. The doorway bears a faint chisel mark, 3 concentric circles with a dot in the center. It's not a known Christian symbol, but a variant has been found in Gnostic manuscripts associated with the concept of pleroma, the fullness of divine presence. That photo never made it into any published archaeological report. It only resurfaced when the student, now retired, donated his negatives to a Jerusalem university. And tucked in the margins of one contact sheet was a handwritten note: "Possibly tomb. Blocked. Location confidential." Why so many tombs were documented then redacted remains an open question. But the locations marked on early sketches show an uncomfortable proximity to sites of immense theological sensitivity beneath Christian chapels, beneath Muslim shrines, beneath Roman-era streets, where excavations are now strictly forbidden. It's hard not to wonder if some of these chambers were sealed not out of safety, but out of fear. That opening them might reveal relics, bodies, or symbols that would upset not just tourists, but entire ecclesiastical narratives. And here's where it circles back. One of the tombs, entry 13 in the 1925 ledger, is noted as having an inscribed threshold. Female figure, name partially preserved, no further comment, no photograph, just that phrase like a whisper at the end of a tunnel. The name, only one word, was recorded before the entry ends in a smudge. Maria. Not Mariam, not Mary the mother. Just Maria. Like a voice interrupted. If even one of these tombs belonged to her, if her body lies within a sealed chamber whose records were deliberately buried, then everything you followed so far, from the ossuaries to the cave churches to the map anomaly, begins to weave together, not as speculation, but as a path. Stone marked, paper erased, truth entombed not just in earth, but in protocol. And if 12 tombs were once listed, how many more were never written down at all? It's the center of the Christian world. Pilgrims file in with eyes wide and hands trembling, kneeling before marble slabs, kissing the ground where heaven supposedly touched earth. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a place of resurrection, of crucifixion, of incense thick as fog and whispers trailing like smoke. But beneath all the solemnity, beneath the gold and stone and careful choreography of veneration, something else rests. Something few talk about. Beneath the church is a network of spaces, some public, others private, and a few that no one seems to claim at all. Let's begin with what's known. Archaeologists have confirmed that the site of the church overlays a series of first-century tombs carved into limestone. The area was once a disused quarry, later adapted as a necropolis during the time of Jesus. This is partly why Emperor Constantine's architects chose it in the 4th century, to align memory with geography. The tomb of Christ, they believed, had to be here, so they built over it, and over everything else nearby. But not everything beneath the church was mapped. In 2016, a team performing ground-penetrating radar GPR analysis under the church's floor panels made a quiet discovery. They found not one sealed chamber but 3. One beneath the Armenian chapel, one beneath the chapel of St. Helena, and a third far stranger lying offset beneath the rotunda, beneath the traditional site of Jesus' own tomb. No press release was issued. No academic paper followed. Just a brief paragraph buried in the GPR firm's technical logbook referencing subsurface anomalies consistent with bricked enclosures. That's archaeologists speak for something's down there. When pressed, church authorities responded with characteristic caution. Access is tightly controlled by a complex system of ownership shared by 6 denominations, each jealously guarding its rights. Even moving a candlestick requires consensus. Digging up sealed vaults unthinkable. And yet, there are hints. In the late 1800s, a Russian priest named Antonin Kapustin wrote in his journal of a narrow stair, long sealed, discovered during repairs in the Armenian chapel. He describes descending 4 steps before being pulled back by guards and warned not to return. His final note on the matter: the air was too still. The silence, unnatural. Then there's the French engineer, Charles Clermont-Ganneau, who reported a strange cavity during his surveys of the site in 1893. He marked it on his diagrams, then crossed it out. The surviving sketch shows a circular chamber oddly isolated, connected by a single tunnel leading west. What could be so dangerous, so unacceptable, that even confirming its existence would require erasure? Now recall the Madaba map's misplaced cemetery, Egeria's mention of a sealed room, the ledger of vanished tombs. Could one of them lie beneath this very church, hidden in plain sanctity, protected not by secrecy, but by bureaucracy? There's something poetic, if a little ironic, about the idea that beneath the marble honoring Christ's resurrection, the church may have entombed the body of the woman who first saw him rise. Mary Magdalene, the first witness, buried beneath a building that never names her. It would explain the discomfort, the missing records, the quiet GPR results, and the growing academic theory that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not just a consolidation of holy memory, but a reorganization, a relocation, a covering. Because if her tomb were found here, just steps from the site of the resurrection, it would force a recalibration of everything. It would confirm that she remained in Jerusalem. that she was venerated, even interred in sacred ground, and that at some point someone decided she needed to be hidden under the memory of another. Of course, no one will confirm any of this. The churches say there's no funding, no agreement, no interest. But silence has a tone, and this one hums with pressure. And so beneath the church that millions visit each year lie 3 sealed vaults, unexcavated, unnamed, unopened. Maybe they're empty. Maybe they hold ancient debris. Or maybe in the hush behind those bricked walls, the body of the Apostola sleeps still buried, where no one thought to look because everyone assumed they already had. It was meant to be routine. In early spring of 1981, a small archaeological team from the Israel Antiquities Authority received permission to investigate a section of subterranean Jerusalem, specifically the area beneath the eastern edge of the Old City near the Church of St. Anne. The paperwork was signed, the permits were issued, and the dig began with little fanfare. But within 6 days, the project was shut down. Sealed, not postponed, not rescheduled, erased, the reason given structural instability. A vague phrase flexible enough to use without further explanation. The official report from the IAA was only 1 paragraph long and made no mention of the chamber they'd uncovered. But unofficially, stories began to leak. A junior assistant who never returned to fieldwork after the event told his professor in confidence that they'd discovered a sealed crypt, one that didn't match any known floor plan, wasn't listed on historical maps, and contained a carved lintel bearing a strange symbol, a fish wrapped in a vine. Christian in design, but unusual. Not Byzantine, not Roman. Something older. The team had barely begun clearing the rubble from the entrance when government representatives arrived. According to internal memos unearthed decades later, officials from the Ministry of Religious Affairs and an unnamed delegation from the Vatican's custody of the Holy Land both arrived on site within 48 hours. After that, the entire zone was locked down. The chamber was resealed. The team was disbanded. No further excavations were allowed in the area. No one ever explained how the Vatican was notified. One letter leaked from a private archive in 1997 contains a single line from a correspondence between a Franciscan archaeologist and the Latin Patriarchate. The chamber confirms the earlier suspicions. The name is too distinct. She must remain undisturbed. The she is never identified. The letter cuts off abruptly, and the second page is missing. You remember the earlier whispers, 12 vanished tombs, a scratched Maria, a mosaic anomaly under the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They felt like speculation. This, however, was action. Someone sealed a dig site within a week. Someone stopped what looked like a quiet academic project and buried it under official silence. That doesn't happen over nothing. What makes it more compelling is the parallel story told by a group of French journalists visiting the Old City at the same time. They claimed they were denied access to the Church of St. Anne and its surrounding grounds due to unexplained construction hazards, yet no construction was ever visible. When they inquired with local residents, they were told the area had been touched by the bones of the wrong woman. Those words shouldn't mean anything, but they do. They call back the inscription of Maria of the Tomb on the Byzantine fresco in Macedonia. They echo Egeria's mysterious sealed room, and they sync unnervingly well with the coordinates of entry number 9 in the vanished British Mandate records, a tomb with a female figure and a partially preserved name. Why such panic over an ancient burial chamber? Jerusalem is full of them. Unless, of course, it wasn't just a tomb. Unless it was her tomb. A resting place no one expected to find or admit existed. And the symbol, the fish entwined with a vine. It has no direct biblical reference, but scholars of early Christian mysticism have drawn connections to the living vine spoken of in apocryphal Gospels. Some even argue the symbol represents a lineage, a bloodline kept in secret. That may be theological embroidery, but its presence in a sealed tomb would be enough to ignite every conspiracy engine ever built, which is precisely why it had to disappear. When you retrace the steps of that excavation, through documents, through rumors, through the slivers of memory left behind, you sense a pattern not of coincidence, but choreography. Someone moved quickly, efficiently, globally, and left just enough behind to suggest that what was found was not allowed to be found. The chamber remains sealed, the coordinates redacted. But if that stone lintel still bears her name or even part of it, then the story you're tracing is no longer just text and theory. It's ground, dust, bone, and there's no going back once that door opens. It broke like a storm in 2007, headlines flashing with bold claims, documentaries rolling out with dramatic music, and press conferences whispering the unthinkable. Had archaeologists stumbled upon the family tomb of Jesus himself, the Talpiot tomb, discovered quietly in 1980 during construction of a new housing complex, contained 10 ossuaries. 6 of them bore inscriptions. Among those names, Jesus, son of Joseph Maria Jose, and most controversially, Mariamne e Mara. You've heard that name before. The initial excavation was unceremonious. The Israeli Antiquities Authority catalogued the tomb, removed the ossuaries, and moved on. It wasn't until decades later that filmmaker Simcha Jacobovici and Titanic director James Cameron reignited interest by proposing a radical theory that the tomb housed the remains of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and perhaps even a child. It sent scholars into frenzied debates, church officials into quiet panic, and archaeologists into awkward distance. But behind the media frenzy, a quieter question simmered, one you now return to with new context. If Mariamne e Mara does refer to Mary Magdalene, and if this tomb was sealed in the 1st century, then why was the chamber quietly handled and never thoroughly explored? And more importantly, why did the records regarding nearby tombs in Talpiot vanish around the same time? Because the Talpiot tomb wasn't the only one found in that area. At least 2 others were reported in the weeks following the original discovery. One, known as the Patio Tomb, was re-examined in 2010 and revealed an ossuary engraved with a fish and what some interpret as a Jonah figure. The symbolism is complex, possibly Gnostic, possibly Proto-Christian, but certainly unusual. The second tomb, no one talks about it. It was briefly mentioned in a Jerusalem Planning Committee meeting dated March 1981. A note in the margin reads, "Second chamber discovered adjacent to Talpiot site. Contents sealed by private request. No further excavation permitted. No name, no coordinates, no follow-up." But here's where it spirals deeper. The missing tomb lines up with data from the now sealed 1981 excavation. It's geographically consistent with entry Zucker 11 in the vanished mandate ledger. And if whispers from academic backchannels hold any truth, it was the location of the lintel bearing the fish and vine symbol. You start to see the outlines of something deliberate. The media attention around the Jesus tomb may have been a smokescreen. While critics and believers debated paternity, marriage, and inscriptions, a more quietly dangerous discovery was being shuffled out of sight. Because while the claim that Jesus' bones were found caused theological distress, it was still abstract deniable. But the bones of Mary Magdalene buried under her proper name, under a symbol linked to wisdom traditions and female leadership, that would be harder to dismiss, especially if that tomb hadn't been disturbed for 2 millennia. In the Gospel of Mary, she speaks of a journey through inner places, layers of spiritual ascent. Scholars once assumed it was metaphor. But what if her followers interpreted it literally? What if her resting place was chosen to reflect that path? A sequence of sealed chambers, symbols marking thresholds. A burial as initiatory as it was reverent. It's not a new idea. Secret tombs with spiritual significance appear in Egyptian rites, Jewish mysticism, even Mithraic cults. But to find one beneath modern Jerusalem bearing her name, that would change the conversation. And yet, the Talpiot controversy burned hot and fast. Accusations of fraud, statistical gymnastics, debates over the commonness of the names. Eventually, the narrative quieted. Attention moved on. But the Mariamne e Mara ossuary was never conclusively dismissed. The bones were missing by the time it was examined. The tomb itself had been disturbed, the chamber resealed and crucial inscriptions weathered down in ways no one could fully explain. Convenient. You recall the frescoes, the cave title Apostola, the sealed crypt beneath the sepulchre. Each discovery orbiting the idea that Mary was not simply a witness, but a teacher, a leader, and a threat to the emerging narrative of apostolic succession. Her grave, if found, would shatter the idea that she vanished. It would prove she remained, that she was remembered, and perhaps that she had followers who went to great lengths to ensure her story would not die, even if her name was scraped off the stones. The Talpiot tomb might not be hers, but the attempt to bury its questions just like the chamber in 1981 suggests someone somewhere thought it was close enough to warrant silence. Sometimes history doesn't whisper, it scratches. Faint lines on broken pottery, carved letters on weathered stone inscriptions that should say little but end up screaming through the dust. The Kidron Valley east of Jerusalem is scattered with such fragments. Ancient shards unearthed during roadwork, garden construction, and occasional sanctioned digs. Most are catalogued, numbered, and forgotten. But one unearthed in 1994 and stored briefly in a university archive sparked a ripple that still hasn't fully faded. It's a fragment of limestone not much larger than a human hand. Found near the mouth of a first-century burial shaft, it bore a partial inscription in Aramaic. 2 lines. The first one read, Shalom leMariamne, peace to Mariamne. The second, badly eroded, carried only 3 visible letters. They were not complete enough for certainty, but one epigrapher, before being hushed, claimed they formed part of the word shetar, loosely translatable as covenant or document. At first glance, it sounds benign, but combine the location, the era, and the name, and it becomes volatile. It wasn't the first time Mariamne had surfaced in these hills. You've already encountered it in the ossuary from the Talpiot tomb, in apocryphal texts, and on iconography far from Israel. The name itself wasn't entirely uncommon in the 1st century, but it was associated with royal bloodlines, educated women, and one particularly dangerous figure in early Christianity. When paired with the right context, Mariamne stops being just a name. It becomes a flag. Within days of its discovery, the inscription was removed from public records. It vanished from dig logs, and the shard itself was relocated to a private storeroom. The student who documented it, now a respected epigrapher, refuses to discuss it publicly. In a rare moment of candor during a conference, he simply said, "That fragment, it didn't go missing. It went quiet." Theories sprouted quickly. Some believed the inscription marked the tomb of a revered female disciple. Others insisted it was part of a cryptic burial rite used by Gnostic sects who believed Mary Magdalene had been entrusted with secret knowledge, a covenant passed down through hidden lineages. The Catholic Church, when asked about the artifact, responded with an unusual amount of certainty for something officially undocumented. There is no historical basis for linking such inscriptions with the Magdalene. A curious overcorrection. Other inscriptions have emerged since then. A fresco fragment unearthed during drainage work near the Church of St. Anne included the faint outline of a woman's figure with the Greek word mnem scrawled nearby memory. The woman is unlabeled. The word is incomplete. But the image captured before the wall was reburied for structural safety is haunting. Her hands are raised not in prayer, but in a gesture of instruction. You remember the cave churches, the apostola carving, and the silence that followed the 1981 sealing. This again feels familiar. Pieces showing just enough to stir interest, then buried beneath explanations too tidy to trust. What makes it all the more compelling is the pattern of nervous removal. These are not dramatic spotlight moments. They happen in quiet corners. A dig shut down, a document withdrawn, a student encouraged to change fields. The Magdalene, it seems, is still being edited from the stone record, just as she once was from Scripture. And yet the stones keep talking. An unverified photo circulated briefly online before being taken down shows another shard discovered near the ancient pool of Siloam. This one bears a crude, hand-carved image, a woman standing before a tree with 7 branches, a symbol sometimes interpreted in mystic traditions as divine wisdom, Sophia. Scholars have long debated whether the Magdalene was ever associated with this figure. The Gospel of Mary certainly leans that way. The Pistis Sophia goes further. The tree, if real, could be the bridge between myth and archaeology. But again, no official record remains. The stone is gone. The dig is sealed. The only clue is a side comment in a private forum from a volunteer at the site. They told us not to mention the woman on the tree. The Magdalene inscriptions don't offer proof, not in the way of DNA or signed manuscripts, but they form a breadcrumb trail, one etched in stone rather than paper, harder to forge, harder to explain away. And they keep appearing in places they shouldn't, saying things people don't want to read. She is everywhere and nowhere, named but never confirmed, remembered but never officially allowed to rest. And if even one of those fragments marks the entrance to a tomb, hers or a community that followed her, then the silence surrounding them isn't academic caution. It's protection. Beneath the western edge of the Temple Mount lies a labyrinth, narrow corridors carved into bedrock, torch-lit paths, winding beneath the holiest square of land in Jerusalem. Most visitors walk the tunnels as tourists ushered past Herodian stones and ancient arches, marveling at their scale. But what they're not shown, what maps and guides deliberately avoid, are the passages that turn inward. Sealed doors, bricked arches, and one tunnel that ends not in ruin but in refusal. It's called the Silent Corner by the guards, a terminus where the pathway narrows, then stops at a sandstone wall scarred by age and something older hesitation. There's a story told only in passing about a group of workers sent to clear debris there in the 1960s. They uncovered a mosaic, just a fragment. But its image was clear, a woman standing beneath an arch, one hand raised in benediction, the other holding what looked like a scroll. Above her, in ancient Greek, were the words Sophia Mariamne. The workers took a photograph. Within hours, the site was closed. The mosaic was removed. The corner was sealed. No official record remains. Now pause for a moment. The Temple Mount is a charged place sacred to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam alike. Excavation here is rare, heavily monitored, often banned. Anything found must be catalogued under intense scrutiny, if it's even acknowledged at all. And yet this image, if it ever truly existed, was not only ignored, but erased. why the name Mariamne alone is potent. You've seen it inscribed on ossuaries etched into cave walls hinted at in mosaics from Serbia to Spain. But paired with Sophia wisdom, it becomes dangerous. Because in Gnostic tradition, Sophia is more than a concept. She is the divine feminine, the cosmic mind, the one who descended into darkness to bring light. And in several texts, Mary Magdalene is equated with her. Not metaphorically, but directly. This isn't just theological poetry. It's a claim to power, a claim that the Magdalene was not only a disciple, but the living embodiment of wisdom itself, the bearer of hidden truth. And if that's what the mosaic showed, a woman placed beneath the temple center of divine order, then someone decided quickly that it couldn't remain. You return to the Gospel of Mary, her vision of the soul ascending through layers of reality, her authority over the frightened disciples, her insistence that salvation comes not from law or ritual, but from knowledge. That gospel reads less like a sermon and more like a map. One that perhaps led someone sometime to mark a place deep beneath the temple. The irony is almost too rich. The institution that labored so long to silence her may have built directly above her memory. The Temple Mount, once the heart of Jewish ritual, became the foundation of a Christian empire. And beneath it all, if the rumors are true, sleeps a mosaic no one wants to name. There are additional whispers. In 1999, during unsanctioned construction work in the area known as Solomon's Stables, debris was removed in haste. Among the rubble now stored in plastic containers outside the city was a carved stone fragment featuring a female figure surrounded by concentric circles, identical to the symbol found on the now lost limestone shard from the Kidron Valley. When asked about its significance, one supervisor replied tersely, "It's not what you think, and it's not going anywhere. You think back to the frescoes, the inscriptions, the sealed crypts, the 1981 sealing order. Every clue points not to dispersion, but convergence. All orbiting Jerusalem, all circling something hidden beneath it. And if the mosaic in the silent corner was real, if even one of these tunnels leads to a chamber dedicated not to a king nor a prophet, but a woman whose truth had to be buried in stone, then we are no longer in the realm of speculative theology. We're standing just outside her door, and that's why no one digs deeper. Not because there's nothing to find, but because they know exactly what's there. It's a peaceful place, just outside the Lion's Gate, tucked into the eastern slope of the Kidron Valley. Lanterns swing gently in the breeze. Incense lingers in the air like old breath, and footsteps echo off the stone steps that descend into shadow. This is the traditional site of the tomb of the Virgin Mary, venerated for centuries, bathed in devotion and unquestioned in its purpose. But here's the uncomfortable possibility. What if it's not the Virgin resting here at all? What if this tomb, this hallowed space of prayers and processions, is a redirection? The Church of Mary's Rest, as it's sometimes called, was built atop what is believed to be a first-century burial chamber. Byzantine pilgrims wrote of it. Crusaders fortified it. Greek Orthodox, Armenian Coptic, and Syriac communities all lay claim to its sanctity. And yet, its origin is oddly blank. No inscription names the woman inside. No ancient text firmly locates Mary the Mother here. The attribution arises late centuries after her death and leans heavily on tradition, not archaeology. More curiously, the original entrance to the tomb lies offset from the altar. It's narrow, misaligned, and partially bricked. In 1972, a French archaeological team granted brief access to the subchambers, described a side corridor leading to a sealed chamber containing 2 burial niches. Both were empty. but one bore a chiseled marking on the wall behind it, a fish intertwined with a star. That symbol again. The team's report was never officially published. Only a photocopied summary circulated among scholars, and even that has since disappeared from most institutional archives. One surviving copy found in a private university collection includes a hand-drawn sketch of the chamber. It labels the marked niche simply as Magdalene. Was this tomb ever meant to house Mary the Virgin? Or did someone else once rest here, someone later moved, misattributed or hidden behind safer devotion? Liturgical confusion only fuels the suspicion. Early Christian texts are inconsistent about Mary the Mother's death and burial. Some say she was taken body and soul into heaven, the Assumption. Others mention Ephesus, not Jerusalem, as her final home. No consensus ever formed. But the Virgin's absence had to be resolved. A tomb was needed, and there already in place was one with ancient architecture, female-centric, mysterious, easily reassigned. You recall the mosaic beneath the temple tunnels, the bricked-up crypts, the erased ossuary, and the fresco of the Apostolate. Each one leaves a trail of presence without permission of a woman whose memory couldn't be removed, only redirected. There's more. In the 1930s, a monk cataloging prayer graffiti inside the tomb's antechamber noted something strange. The most common scratched name on the walls wasn't Maria. It was Mariamne, scrawled in Latin, Greek, and Aramaic, some accompanied by symbols of teaching: a scroll, a flame, a key. These weren't the markings of people pleading for intercession. They were tributes, memorials, as if those who visited believed they stood before a forgotten teacher, not just a holy mother. Later visitors report that many of those inscriptions have been plastered over or polished out. No official explanation has been given. And then there's the oral tradition, a fragile but persistent thread. In nearby Silwan, an elderly Christian family keeps a worn scroll passed down through generations. It's written in Judeo-Arabic and mentions a woman whose light remains beneath the hill. The word used isn't Isa, mother of Jesus, but Al-Hawariya, the female apostle. They've always believed the tomb beneath the valley holds her. Not the Virgin, the other Mary, the one who stayed. It's possible this is all coincidence, a convergence of similar names and confusing centuries. The Church's attribution may be correct. But you begin to wonder if somewhere along the way the truth was swapped. Not maliciously, just conveniently. A woman had to be remembered, another had to be forgotten, their names close enough, their stories tangled, one placed in the light, the other behind the wall. You don't typically associate medieval knights with ancient gospels. But the Knights Templar were never typical. Founded in Jerusalem in 1119, these warrior monks vowed to protect pilgrims on the road to the Holy Land. Yet over time, their mission shifted. Their headquarters built directly atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple, their rituals increasingly esoteric, and their true obsession hidden in the margins of their own legends, a woman veiled in secrecy, invoked in whispers, embedded in symbols. Mary Magdalene. Her name doesn't appear in their official documents, of course, but the traces are there, carved into church capitals, woven into seals, painted into frescoes that never quite match official theology. One of the earliest Templar chapels in England, in the village of Templecombe, contained a peculiar image discovered centuries later behind plaster. A woman seated, robed with unbound hair and a faint smile. No halo, no crown, and no label. Yet the locals, when pressed, referred to her as the Lady. The original Templars had access to Jerusalem in ways few others did. Their residence atop the Temple Mount, known to them as the Al-Aqsa Mosque, allowed them to excavate. Quietly, persistently. They were digging, and not for coins. Rumors from the 12th century speak of tunnels, unearthed scrolls, found artifacts spirited away under cover of night. Some believed they were searching for the Ark of the Covenant. Others claimed they sought Solomon's lost wisdom. But what if they were looking for her? Consider this: many of the early Templars came from regions steeped in Magdalene lore, southern France, especially where the cult of Mary Magdalene thrived. They would have grown up with tales of a woman who fled Jerusalem carrying sacred knowledge, not a penitent sinner, but a bearer of truth. Some even whispered she carried a child. When the Templars returned from Jerusalem, their symbolism changed. The two-rider seal, the unmarked tomb. The constant appearance of seven-pointed stars and red crosses, both associated with Gnostic interpretations of divine feminine power. The order began commissioning chapels named not after Christ or the Virgin, but after La Dame. In one Templar manuscript now preserved in the Vatican, a marginal note refers to the Lady of the Hidden Light and associates her with a sealed chamber beneath the mount. It doesn't say who she is, but the phrasing echoes the Gospel of Mary. And the sealed chamber appears again in later documents, most notably in a 14th century inventory drawn up during the suppression of the order. Among the items listed as recovered from a French commandery, one reliquary carved with a fish and vine motif. Contents unknown. By then, the Templars were being accused of heresy, of worshipping false idols, of kissing forbidden icons. These charges, almost certainly fabricated, nonetheless reveal something true. The Church was afraid, not just of their power, but of their knowledge, their private rites, their strange symbols, their silence. In the decades after the order was disbanded, many of their properties were seized or burned. But a few fell into other hands, quiet allies who preserved what the knights left behind. Among those relics, a scroll found in Languedoc in 1781, written in Latin and encoded with ciphered names. One entry refers to a rose queen in exile, interred in the eastern city known only by the vine. The phrase is maddeningly vague, but you've seen its elements before. The vine, the eastern city, the hidden queen, all of them wrapped around a single figure, Mary Magdalene. Could the Templars have found her tomb? Could their silence have been a form of guardianship, not ignorance? Perhaps they knew what she meant to early Christianity. Perhaps they believed her resting place needed to be protected, not for dogma, but for fear of what it might undo. After all, a faith built on a particular succession, apostles, bishops, popes, might not survive the resurrection of a woman's voice, especially one buried beneath Jerusalem inside a chamber long sealed by fear. The Church called the Templars heretics, but perhaps they were historians. There is a room in the Vatican where silence feels like policy. The Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, now rebranded with the gentler name the Vatican Apostolic Archive, is a fortress of memory. Nearly 52 miles of shelving containing papal correspondence, diplomatic reports, inquisitorial transcripts, and documents so ancient they were written while the Western Roman Empire still stood. Most researchers never get beyond the outer chambers. Fewer still see what lies beneath. And among the thousands of lost or restricted records, one letter continues to unsettle those who whisper about it. It was first referenced in 1672 by a German Jesuit historian named Matthias Kircher, who noted in his personal journal the existence of a troubling correspondence from a prior age housed in a sealed drawer within the Vatican section of Eastern missions. The letter, he claimed, described a reliquary of the woman apostle hidden beneath Jerusalem and entrusted to an unnamed brotherhood. he never published the journal. It surfaced in the 1980s in the private estate of a retired scholar from Munich. The single reference to the letter might have been dismissed as scholarly embellishment until it was cross-checked against another account. A 1743 catalogue of items within the Vatican's sub-collection on Apocrypha and heresy, listed under restricted holdings, an envelope labeled Epistola Antiochus ad Damasum re femina sepulta sub civitate, translated the letter of Antiochus to Damasus concerning the woman buried beneath the city. It was quickly removed from subsequent catalogues. Damasus, as you may know, was the Bishop of Rome in the 4th century, a key figure in codifying church doctrine and aligning it with Roman power. Antiochus is a more obscure character, possibly a bishop from Jerusalem or Antioch, possibly pseudonymous. No one is sure. But the implication is chilling. Someone warned the early church about a burial in Jerusalem. A woman, important enough to record, dangerous enough to conceal. No copy of the letter has been confirmed to exist today. But 3 independent scholars granted limited access to Vatican documents in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Each made passing mention of a file related to a Marian cryptus. All 3 accounts described the document as highly restricted, untranslated, and tagged for suppression. One even claimed it referenced a chamber beneath the tomb of the Nazarene containing scrolls and bones. That phrase alone in context is devastating. It implies proximity. That her tomb wasn't somewhere out in the wilderness, but beneath or near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. If that's true, then everything, the erased mosaic, the bricked tunnels, the GPR anomalies, falls into place. The Church, of course, denies all of it. Inquiries into the Epistola Antiochus have been met with polite deflection. One archivist noted that the letter's title appears fabricated. Another more candidly admitted that many items have been mislabeled or lost over time, particularly during Napoleon's looting of the archives in the 19th century. Convenient that. Yet the Vatican's behavior betrays more than its words. In 1963, a Jesuit researcher named Father Eusebius Montag published a private monograph titled The Witness Beneath the Stone. In it, he speculated that several apocryphal traditions shared a common origin, a suppressed burial, one that had been known to the early church and actively concealed. Montag was reprimanded, his access was revoked, and his writings were pulled from circulation. Only a handful of copies survive in private libraries today. You recall the 1981 sealing order, the Talpiot inscriptions, the Church of Mary's Rest, the recurring symbols vine fish star flame. They point not to abstraction, but to preservation. And if the Vatican received word of a tomb centuries ago, one containing the bones of the Magdalene possibly, with writings, then the decision not to acknowledge it becomes less about denial and more about control. Because once you confirm her presence, you invite her voice. And her voice from every fragment we've encountered is not a quiet one. If that letter still exists, and if it's buried beneath layers of glass Latin and silence, it may be the last missing piece in a puzzle the Church has been turning upside down for over 1,000 years. Or maybe not missing, maybe just deliberately misplaced. It arrived without fanfare, folded parchment sealed in wax, delivered by courier to the archivum of the Jesuit Collegio Romano. Inside a field report. Not political, not theological, archaeological. And buried in its careful Latin script was a line that would have burned like wildfire had it reached the wrong eyes. A chamber beneath the old city, a tomb, a woman, and 7 stars. The report was penned by Father Girolamo di Spagna, a Jesuit scholar dispatched to Jerusalem in late 1610 under the guise of ecclesiastical diplomacy. In truth, he was tasked with investigating a rumor a local Christian sect claimed to have knowledge of a hidden tomb in the Christian quarter, one not listed on any official registry. They called it the Lighted Hollow, a phrase suggesting not just a physical location, but something deeply symbolic. Di Spagna, thorough and skeptical, began by interviewing monks and stonemasons. Most offered little. But a blind elder, once a worker on underground aqueduct restoration, spoke of a narrow passage beneath the Via Dolorosa. It was not part of the waterworks, he said. It was dry, still. But the walls were smooth and the air not right. That was all the permission the Jesuits needed. They gained quiet access through a now lost entrance behind a convent bakery. The tunnel was steep, just wide enough for one man to descend at a time. At its end, a bricked arch, and behind it, opened with silent tools and more prayers than hammers, lay a chamber cut from the rock. The dimensions were precise. 5 paces long, 3 wide, 2.5 high. It was undecorated except for a single mosaic embedded in the rear wall, a female figure in profile. Her hair unbound, her robe draped over one shoulder, and above her 7 small stars arranged in an arc. No name, no script. But a presence so immediate that Di Spagna's companion reportedly dropped to his knees upon seeing it. In his report, Di Spagna noted, "We believe her to be the woman called Maria, not the Virgin, but the other. The one who saw the tomb opened. The one who was told not to touch. He took only a rubbing of the mosaic. No artifacts were removed. The chamber was resealed, and when the Jesuits attempted to return a week later, they found the passage collapsed." The local officials denied any knowledge of excavation in the area. The convent wall had already been rebuilt. The report made its way back to Rome. It was copied once, filed, then restricted. Only a handful of cardinals would have seen it. In later decades, it was presumed lost until 1998, when a researcher discovered a reference to document 879 subterranean Marian anomaly in a Jesuit ledger. The document itself was gone. But the summary entry remained. Observation confirms presence of female sepulchre of uncertain origin. Iconography consistent with Sophia Marian attribution. Location now inaccessible. No further inquiry authorized. That phrase, Sophia Marian attribution, once again fuses the Magdalene with wisdom, knowledge, and divine presence. It aligns with the Gnostic gospel fragments, with the mosaic beneath the Temple Mount, with the cave inscription of Apostola, with the vanished ossuary marked Mariamne e Mara. It becomes impossible to see this report as isolated. 7 stars. In the book of Revelation, the 7 stars are held in the right hand of the risen Christ. They are the angels of the 7 churches, symbols of divine guidance. But in early mystic traditions, stars also represented hidden knowledge. The unseen light. The voices history tried to silence. Some believe the 7 stars in that chamber referred to 7 teachings. Others say 7 guardians. One radical fringe theory suggests 7 other women who followed the Magdalene in secret, forming a community that preserved her words and perhaps her body. We'll never know. The chamber is gone. The convent that once stood above it is now a restaurant. But if the report is to be believed, the memory of what lay beneath remains unshakable. The Jesuits didn't destroy the chamber. They documented it, filed it, sealed it. Which begs the question, why report something if you never intend to reveal it? Perhaps they feared it would come to light on someone else's terms. Or perhaps they were waiting for the right moment. Burials don't usually get retested. Once a tomb is sealed, once the bones are cataloged and stored, the story tends to fade. until someone opens a drawer, runs a swab, and history shivers. That's what happened in 2016 quietly in a private European lab using samples obtained under strict anonymity. The bones came from a 1st-century ossuary, one long disconnected from its original tomb, stored in a museum basement labeled simply Mariamne, no provenance. A postdoctoral researcher working on a broader study of genetic markers in early Judean populations decided to test it anyway. Not because she suspected anything, just because it was there. But when the results came back, they didn't match expectations. In fact, they didn't match anything in the comparative Jerusalem sample group at all. The mitochondrial DNA passed only from mother to child, traced to a haplogroup not commonly found in the Levant during the 1st century. Instead, it pointed to a northern Anatolian origin. Unusual, but not impossible. More intriguing was the genetic distance from other ossuaries stored nearby bones, labeled with male names from the same approximate period. No familial match. The woman was buried among them, but not of them. This was noted, flagged, and shelved, until someone somewhere made a connection. In early 2017, a sealed envelope arrived at the lab with no return address. Inside, a scanned image of the Mariamne Emara inscription from the Talpiot tomb, a copy of the Gnostic Gospel translation referencing Mary Magdalene's lineage, and a typed note, "Find the connection." It wasn't by accident. The lab didn't pursue it, not officially. Funding was tight. Protocols were strict, but the postdoc did. She revisited the sample. Compared it to earlier results from remains reportedly found near the Garden Tomb bones, so fragmented they hadn't been assigned a definitive identity, but dated to roughly the same period. This second sample had always been unusual, an outlier in terms of diet and isotope composition. Possibly a foreigner, possibly elite. Now compared with the Mariamne ossuary, a match emerged, a strong one. The conclusion: the two individuals shared a maternal line. Perhaps sisters, perhaps mother and daughter, perhaps something more complicated, but undeniably linked. Of course, the find couldn't be published, not without provenance, not with those kinds of implications. The Mariamne box had no verified tomb. The Garden Tomb sample had been obtained under unclear circumstances, possibly even without full institutional permission. To go public would mean opening a pit of regulatory, political, and theological snakes. So it stayed quiet. But the whispers started. A symposium on early Christian burial practices in Rome was canceled last minute. A keynote speaker disappeared from the schedule without explanation. The postdoc reassigned. The lab's director now refers to the ossuary as unavailable for further study due to legal constraints. No one says Magdalene, but the air hums with avoidance. You recall the Jesuit report, The Woman and the 7 Stars, the bricked-up tombs, the missing letter, the consistent refusal to dig in precisely the areas where her presence is suspected. And now this, a biological echo, not metaphor, not inscription, flesh and bone, silent but undeniable. What does it mean for traditional theology, everything and nothing? The Church has long insisted that physical remains are irrelevant to spiritual truth. But for history, for the idea that Mary Magdalene may have lived, died, and been buried in Jerusalem, it changes the game. It offers weight to claims dismissed as legend. It challenges the idea that she vanished from the record. It even suggests that far from being a marginal figure, she may have had family, descendants, a community. And if the ossuary in question truly is hers, if that humble box once held the bones of the woman called Mara the Master, then someone knew. Someone preserved her, and someone at some point decided to store her name in stone, even as the world tried to forget. The DNA won't tell you where her tomb lies. But it does something subtler, more dangerous. It proves she wasn't a myth. She was a body, a presence, a lineage, still pulsing just beneath the surface of a story we thought we'd already buried. Maps are made to guide you. But the oldest ones, those drawn in ink and instinct, often hide more than they reveal. They speak in symbols, in absences, in misdirections shaped like warnings, and sometimes they don't lead you to treasure. They lead you to secrets people spent centuries trying not to find. In 1857, a faded scroll surfaced in the private collection of a French nobleman with Templar ancestry. It was brittle, ink-washed, and signed only with a cross. But the content was striking, a rudimentary map of Jerusalem drawn not as it was, but as it might have been beneath. The map focused not on churches or city gates, but on tunnels, chambers, spaces unaccounted for in official topography. At its center, a sigil resembling a seven-pointed star intertwined with a vine. Next to it, two words written in Latin, Domina Occulta, the hidden lady. Most dismissed it as a medieval fantasy, but not everyone. In 1902, an Austrian antiquarian named August von Hersfeld claimed to have located one of the entry points marked on the map, an archway beneath a disused well on the eastern edge of the city. He never published his findings. His notes discovered after his death mention a small room of carved stone, sealed with heat, not mortar, and a strange groove like a keyhole cut into the wall. That entry, according to local accounts, was later buried under a municipal building. No excavation followed, but the groove, shaped like an almond with a twist at the top, matched something else. An object held in a Jesuit archive in Avignon known only as the Magdalene key. It's a palm-sized piece of iron shaped like a teardrop. For centuries, it was dismissed as ceremonial, but its unusual contour completely impractical for any standard lock baffled even locksmiths. The only known writing attached to it came from a 17th century inventory, where it was labeled clavis ad fidem vetustum, key to the ancient faith. By the 1930s, the key had become a curiosity, then a relic, then a myth, until 2003. That year, a scholar of esoteric traditions researching in the archives of the French Dominican order came across a set of correspondences between monks in the late 1800s discussing the key and the oath. One letter, translated hastily from Latin, stated, "She must remain undisturbed. The key must never meet the map. We swore at Golgotha, and we will keep it." They weren't speaking in riddles. They were referencing something real. The oath appears again in a 1921 diary from a Franciscan priest stationed in Jerusalem. He writes of an informal gathering between clergy and local leaders, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, who had all heard rumors of a tomb. Not just any tomb. One beneath sacred ground. One containing bones that could not be named. They agreed, he said, to maintain the peace through silence. And suddenly, the scattered puzzle pieces begin to fit. The map, forgotten in a noble's collection, points to an underground network beneath the old city. The key, held by those sworn never to use it, matches an architectural groove in a now sealed chamber. The oath, an interfaith agreement forged not for diplomacy, but for containment, explains why every attempt to follow this trail has been quietly, consistently, and globally interrupted. This isn't about suppressing her out of malice. It may have started that way. But now it feels like fear. Not of her. Of what finding her might undo. Because if Mary Magdalene lies beneath Jerusalem, truly lies there intact, named remembered in stone, it would unthread a tightly woven tapestry. Not destroy it, but shift its gravity, tilt its center. It would vindicate the Gnostic Gospels. It would confirm the Church Fathers' omissions. It would justify the Templar obsession. It would connect the DNA, the tombs, the frescoes, the chants to the Lady of Light. And worst of all, for institutions built on order, it would set fire to a story that has for centuries been too neatly bound. One map, one key, and a vow that has lasted over 1,000 years. But vows like maps can be broken, especially when someone somewhere finally decides to turn the key. It's no longer just a question of whether Mary Magdalene's tomb exists beneath Jerusalem. By now you've followed enough breadcrumbs, ossuaries, mosaics, sealed vaults, erased inscriptions, unspoken oaths, to know the trail doesn't vanish by accident. It bends. It spirals. It gets buried. But it doesn't disappear. So the real question becomes, why is there so much resistance to even asking? Why do excavations get halted? Letters get removed. DNA results get shelved. Why does her presence more than any other apostle, more even than Jesus' own siblings, send history into lockdown mode? The answer is as simple as it is vast. Because if she's found, everything shifts. Start with doctrine. If Mary Magdalene was buried in Jerusalem and honored in secret, then the foundational myth of her exile of the weeping sinner turned saint in Provence collapses. Centuries of liturgy, pilgrimage, and sanctified folklore fall away. The narrative of repentance is replaced by one of repression, but that's only the beginning. Her tomb, if discovered and confirmed, would legitimize the apocryphal Gospels, texts the Church dismissed as heresy, yet which consistently depict her not as a follower, but a leader, a teacher. The teacher. The resurrection witness who understood what the others did not. The one Jesus trusted with his final words. And if that version of Mary was real, then the early Christian movement had more than one cornerstone. It had two, and one of them was buried. And then there's the matter of succession. The Church built its authority on apostolic lineage, Peter the Rock, a male chain of custody, unbroken, unwavering. But what if there was a second line, one oral, hidden, possibly feminine? What if the earliest Christian community was not structured like a pyramid, but a circle, one that included Mary as a co-equal voice? Her tomb wouldn't just represent a challenge to dogma. It would embody an alternate origin story. A church built with two doors, and someone long ago locked one of them shut. You remember the Jesuit report, the mosaic of the woman and the 7 stars. The DNA from the ossuary that didn't match the men around it. The fish and vine motif. The bricked arch beneath the convent. The early church fathers who nervously edited her out, and the modern institutions that still deny her in. And then there's politics. A revelation of this scale in Jerusalem, a city already claimed, divided, venerated by 3 world religions, would ignite something far beyond academic debate. There are fears of desecration, pilgrimage chaos, even holy war. A body found in the wrong chamber beneath the wrong shrine could turn reverence into riot. Governments would intervene. Religious authorities would bury the news faster than any archaeologist could exhume it. No press conference, no DNA confirmation, just silence. Again. And yet the danger runs deeper still. Because beneath the theological tremors, beneath the political aftershocks, is a quieter, more destabilizing possibility that people might listen to her. That in a world craving meaning beyond hierarchy, Mary Magdalene's rediscovered presence might inspire not just awe, but awakening. Her teachings, long buried in esoteric texts, speak of inward revelation, direct knowledge, divine equality. Ideas that echo louder now than ever before. And institutions, regardless of denomination or creed, don't handle awakening well. They are built to preserve. not to transform, so they bury her, with bricks and silence, with paperwork and protocol, with storybooks for the masses and locked drawers for the truth. And they tell you she left, that she wept, that she was grateful to be forgotten. But she didn't weep in the Gospel of Mary. She taught, she argued, she stood her ground while Peter trembled. And if she is buried in Jerusalem, then her silence has been strategic, not surrender, which is why they can't let her be found. Because once you find her, once you walk into that hidden chamber and see her name not erased but carved in reverence, then no amount of doctrine, denial, or distraction can stop the question from rising. Why was she buried in secret, and what truth did she take with her? You stand now at the edge of the labyrinth, not just of tunnels and bricked vaults, but of centuries of curated forgetting. And at the center lies the most dangerous possibility of all that the tomb exists, not metaphorically, not as poetic mystery, but tangibly. Beneath feet that walk ancient flagstones, beneath incense and chanting, beneath the blinding light of faith. Somewhere beneath Jerusalem, the city of prophets and kings of crucifixion and resurrection, there may lie a chamber holding the remains of a woman the world was never meant to remember properly. A chamber designed not for veneration, but for obscurity. A tomb without inscription. A burial without liturgy. And yet the weight of reverence clings to it like dust to damp stone. Consider everything you've followed to reach this point. A tomb listed and then erased by British officials. A symbol of vine and fish carved above a crypt and quickly sealed. A Jesuit report describing a woman beneath 7 stars. A mosaic of a female teacher hidden in Temple Mount tunnels. A 4th century pilgrim whispering of a sealed chamber. A DNA sequence that doesn't match the men she was buried near. Ossuaries named Mariamne, scrolls never translated, letters that vanished, maps that end where silence begins. It doesn't point to folklore, it points to logistics. Someone remembered her. They built around her. They protected her not with fame, but with forgetting. Not with shrines, but with concrete. And you begin to wonder if that was always the plan. Because some truths don't want to be shouted. They want to hum beneath the earth, to be found only by those who ask the right questions and refuse to stop at the first no. The bricked entrances, the sealed archives, the denied permits, none of them say nothing is here. They say don't look here. But if you could descend down past the tiled mosaics, the soot-darkened churches, the forgotten wells, you might reach a chamber untouched for 2,000 years. One where dust clings to an ossuary whose name is still faint but visible. One where a symbol waits on the wall, a star, a vine, a flame. One where the air is still. Still enough to make you feel you're not alone. Because maybe you're not. Maybe she was never meant to be gone. Maybe she was meant to rest. To be left in peace until the time was right. Until the world was ready. And maybe that time is now. If the last sealed stone were to shift, and the dust of 2,000 years breathed out in silence. If the light of your torch flickered across ancient walls, and your steps echoed in the silence of a place untouched by centuries. If you were to stand there, just stand in the presence of what was hidden, what would you feel? The tomb wouldn't be grand. Not gilded, not imperial. It would be plain, humble, carved by hands that knew reverence, not power. There might be a niche, a name worn down by time letters smoothed into suggestion, a star, a vine, a woman drawn in outline teaching not weeping. The air would hold something heavy, Not just age, but memory. You wouldn't speak. You wouldn't dare. You would feel what others once did, that this place mattered, that she mattered, not as a symbol, not as a fable, but as a voice that wasn't supposed to last and yet somehow did. You might kneel, not out of doctrine, but because your knees would forget how to stand, and the stories would come to you not as pages, but as presence. The way she stood by the cross, the way she stayed when others fled, the way she spoke when silence was safer. You would realize it was never about finding proof. It was about remembering what was never truly lost. You might weep, but not for her. For us. For the centuries we spent pretending she wasn't there while she waited beneath the city, beneath the noise, beneath the dogma. And if you were to stand there and feel the hush hold you, and know without being told that you had found her, you would not need the church to say it. You would not need the scholars to confirm it. You would not need the world to believe it. Because the silence would become the answer, and she would finally be seen.